Thank you, Mauricio, for your kind introduction. And I'm really glad to be here. Thank you to our conference committee for the organization. And so, the purpose of my contribution is to offer some consideration on Schelling's positive philosophy, with particular reference to the philosophy of revelation. My aim is to show how the theme of the Trinity can present an alternative paradigm of subjectivity, one that differs from the model we have inherited from modernity. In order to introduce the significance that the Trinitarian theme assumes in Schelling, it is necessary to briefly reconstruct the trajectory of his thought. Schelling began as a young theology student at the Tübingen Stift, living in a period of transition. On the one hand, he inherited the Kantian challenge of reconciling phenomenon and nomen, freedom and necessity. On the other hand, in the later part of his life, he had to confront the task of understanding an age that no longer placed much trust in the God of the philosophers. It was an age that had lost its central myth, had lost God, and was beginning to seek refuge in a new myth, whether irrationalism, materialism, or positivism. These were very different currents, yet they shared something essential. They all denounced the collapse of every certainty, turning their gaze toward the need to construct a new myth. What, then, does Schelling tell us within this context? Philosophical questioning in Schelling has always been mediated by the need to understand the relation between freedom and necessity, and, especially after Caroline's death in 1809, the fundamental philosophical question, or Grundfrage, increasingly sought to grasp the meaning of this relation. This development is expressed in the distinction introduced by Schelling between negative and positive philosophy. This distinction is notoriously difficult to understand for two reasons, I think. First, Schelling never seems to have provided a definitive formulation of this difference. And second, Schelling's thought has often been misunderstood. In particular, I want to remember an example of this. I think that the clearest example is found in a letter that Sinclair wrote to Hegel, in which Sinclair congratulates Hegel for his phenomenology of spirits, an opera that, according to him, had exposed Schelling as a charlatan. Yet Sinclair immediately admits that he had not actually read Schelling's writings, so he had to know Schelling very better. Regardless of the reception history, the question remains and must be answered. What is the relation between negative and positive philosophy? In my interpretation, the answer can be traced through the philosophy of revelation. One thing is immediately clear. Negative philosophy is based on a rational procedure, whereas positive philosophy rests on a dimension of listening, on the reception of a content that does not originate from the subject, and that must only later be understood rationally, a posteriori. Schematically, we may put it this way. The highest point of negative philosophy is the ontological argument. God is that than which nothing greater can be taught. What does this argument imply? Kant had already emphasized the limit faced by the subject when attempting to demonstrate the existence of God. As the impossibility of determining God's existence, of understanding God as an entity revealed to us, Schelling clarified this in some crucial pages of their Langer lecture. And before addressing this, we must make a brief preliminary reflection. The rational subject, inherited from Western modernity, conceives the relation to otherness as a relation between a subject and an object. The other in this relation becomes an object determined by a subject who, in turn, ends up being determined by its own act of domination. What the subject perceives is the nullity of this relation. The subject is not recognized by the other. It seeks to subordinate the other as in own way to dominate, but what he obtains is not the other in its essence, only an entity reduced to possession, which reveals the vanity of this attempt. Every form of possession fails to grasp the other completely, and above all, every attempt to possession is finite. It slips away and leaves behind an even greater sense of emptiness. In the later lectures, Schelling investigates how these subjects relates to the foundation, the greatest otherness we can conceive. The rational subject believes it can determine the absolute through the ontological proof. The foundation, the ground of all reality, is treated as an object of rational demonstration. But what does this demonstration reveal, if not the empty striving of an entity that, in attempting to determine God as a subordinated object, grasps nothing? According to Schelling, it is impossible to contain the foundation as an object. The concept of being itself is limited. It is a reification of the foundation, a vessel too small to contain the infinite. Thus, the foundation, conceived as an entity that justifies the subject's will to dominate, crumbles. The ontological proof demonstrates nothing except the futile striving of a subject that attempts to place itself above alterity. And by reducing the other to nothingness, the subject receives nothing but the reflection of that nothingness. Schelling really perceived the crisis of this time, the tension between enlightenment and positivism, the loss of a stable foundation, of a myth capable of unifying collective consciousness. His reflection in the philosophy of revelation are essential here. When deprived of the foundation, the subject finds itself in a condition of loss. The world appears emptied of meaning, and what remains is the nothing. In the later lecture, Schelling introduced the theme of the ecstasy of reason, a theme that later commentators tended to downplay in the context of the philosophy of revelation, perhaps for fear of portraying Schelling as an irrationalist. I'm convinced that, even the philosophy of revelation, the theme of the ecstasy of reason remains fundamental, especially in the introductory phase. It marks the passage from negative to positive philosophy. The rational subject is the one who determines. Alterity appears as an entity, as an object. The ecstasy of reason, understood as the subject stepping outside itself, signals a transformation of this paradigm. The subject no longer determines, but is placed in a position of listening, of openness to alterity. The question posed by the subject, in the face of the possibility of nothingness, is the Grundfrage, the search for meaning. Faced with the possibility of nothingness, of nihilism, what is the meaning of creation? Schelling writes that being is insufficient, that it does not express the fullness of the foundation. What remains is an indeterminate, the nothing. How are we to understand this indetermination that precedes being? What is before being is what is not yet. This not yet being appears as a tension, as what will be. Yet, this limitless indeterminacy has indeed become determinate through creation. Thus, alongside a future possibility of determination, there is also what eternally is before creation. Schelling distinguished between the power to be, which becomes determinate in the future, and the act, which is purely existence before creation. These two potencies form two opposing tensions: openness to alterity and closure within oneself, love and selfishness. Potency cannot become act, nor act become potency. A third point is needed, one that is free to move between the two. Freedom, which reconciles potency and act, love and selfishness. The will to become other, love, is mediated by the possible closure into oneself, the refusal to generate, the apeiron satisfied with his own boundlessness. Reconciliation occurs through a contraction within expansion, that is, through creation. Evil is placed in potency, while what remains actual is love. Creation inherits evil in potency. The human being actualizes evil. This occurs through the paradigm mentioned earlier. The Urmensch, the primordial human, who attempts to dominate creation. What defines his nothingness? The fall. Death symbolizes the fall, for it constantly reminds the human being of the nullity of his will to dominate. Every attempt at possession is temporal. Thus the question of despair returns, the Grundfrage. Why does creation exist at all? And why did God not eliminate creation after the fall? The philosophy of revelation addresses these decisive pages. We have said that the basis of creation involves three potencies: openness, closure, and mediation, which in their unity constitute the perfect spirit. Creation thus refers to the Trinity, which enables the dynamism that makes creation alive. Through creation and through the perfect spirit's emergence from self-enclosure, the spirit becomes conscious of itself as Father. In creation, the Father becomes aware of himself as Other. This act of self-recognition eternally generates the Son. The Son shares the same substance as the Father, yet is a distinct person. Is the one who suffers on account of the rupture introduced by the humanity's fall. Is openness and love toward creation, revealing God's personal dimension. Within the duality of Father and Son, the Spirit is the third person, the mediator, the one who does not act immediately, but places unity as a promise, as what is still to come. How, then, does human consciousness experience this relation to the divine? The challenge of positive philosophy is to name that which, first experiencing as nothing, constitutes the primordial foundation of all creation. The God of the philosophers is insufficient. The subject, as person, seeks in the foundation what is personal. What name can we give to God as a person? Creation testifies to the greatness of divine power. Why did God not abolish creation after the fall? There is no rational answer. And this is the true content of positive philosophy. God not only created, but redeems creation through a second creation, revelation. God's choice has no rational reason. It is scandalous. God loves creation so profoundly that he takes upon himself the weight of the fall. In Revelation, God becomes flesh and assumes the necessity of death. The temptation by Satan exemplifies the overcoming of the rational subject's will to dominate. Jesus could have separated creation from the Father, taking possession of it through domination. His refusal reveals openness to alterity. Jesus entrusted himself to the Father because he loves creation. This gives us the name love. Love admits of no rational explanation. Schelling calls revelation the witness to the divine madness of creation. Death no longer signifies merely the end of life and the collapse of human domination. It now marks the possibility of reconciliation with the other, expressing openness to alterity. Today, we face the same challenges Schelling confronts. The contemporary subject inherits the tendencies of positivism. a paradigm in which everything is calculable, limited by a mechanistic worldview with no room for transcendence. The subject is immersed in a culture of immediacy. We see it in an accelerated world incapable of waiting, reducing the other to a function or a threat rather than a person. World that seeks to dominate everything, opposing an apparently calculable finitude. What the modern subjects call concrete, to a distant infinity that seems useless simply because it cannot be measured. Schelling reminds us that the will to dominate the other, to possess alterity, yields only nothingness. The relation between freedom and necessity, finitude and infinity, is not one of separation. The Trinity is the relation structure that animates finitude itself. Without it, the finite could not be what it is. Finitude is placed in a dialectical relation with infinity, a dimension that breaks through the ordinary. Infinity is not distant. It is that through which existence finds its meaning and its concreteness, because infinity does not disdain becoming flesh out of love for creation. Trinitarian life is expressed through a kind of future perfect, against a contemporary paradigm that freezes itself in an increasingly hopeless present. Creation and revelation recall the power of an eternal promise, a promise arising from an eternal past, the yes of creation, projects itself toward a future of redemption, a future that speaks eternal love. For this reason, Revelation invites us into openness toward eternity, a listening that is not judgment, but the continual renewal of recognition. We are open to this recognition and to forgiveness because, Revelation tells us, we have already been forgiven. In Schelling's thought, Revelation enables a new paradigm of subjectivity, a subject that does not dominate alterity, but shares with the other the same participation in the foundation. Because of this participation, the person is indeterminable. The person cannot be reduced to an object of another's judgment, for they participate in the love that grounds creation. Thus, the relation between subject and are revived by a sense of sacredness that makes mutual recognition possible. Living this sacredness opens the element that animates the deepest meaning of existence, hope. Thank you.